Chapter 7: Foundations of Economics and Finance. An ecosystem has four components which form a cycle: abiotic resources, producers, consumers, and decomposers. Modern economics only considers two of these relevant: producers and consumers. It ignores the finite abiotic resources and presumes that their only limit is the producer's ability to turn them into commodities. Similarly, consumers and producers ignore decomposition. Once our waste and detritus is dumped into landfills, lakes, rivers, and the atmosphere and is out of sight, it is, for all intents and purposes, out of mind. Meanwhile, the finite planet is running out of its finite resources. And pollution keeps increasing and is starting to bite back. Typically, the economists solve this problem by waving their hands and mumbling something about substitution and human ingenuity. However, it's obvious that our cultural paradigm is incomplete and that resources and decomposition capacity can no longer be considered infinite. Naturally, the economy can't keep growing without killing itself if the cycle isn't completed. If the cycle is not completed, we're either going to run out of resources or drown in pollution. If a decision is made to solve this problem, the size of the economy would be determined by how efficient the cycle is. Given the enormous size of the human population in relation to the renewable resource base of Earth, completing the cycle and preventing leaks will be to the 21st century what the Cold War was to the 20th century. In this book, we're not focused on the necessary policy decisions, but rather what the individual decisions should be. An economic system has trophic levels, like an ecosystem, with groups or socioeconomic strata feeding off each other. In a growth economy, there are workers, organizers of workers, owners of assets, and owners of land. In a complete ecology, there are abiotics, producers, consumers, and decomposers. Humans are sufficiently adaptable to execute any of these roles in either system. Economic decision-making must be expanded to include all these factors. Until such an understanding is codified into human behavior via law, religion, and values, something that those who profit from the current setup are not apt to do anytime soon, individuals need to act as if such a code already existed, since economic decision-making eventually does catch up to reality. The economy has many unrecognized inefficiencies. It is, for example, possible for more people to play the role of decomposers by recycling and upcycling, and producers, as well as becoming less dependent on abiotic resources. The challenge is to do this within the existing framework. Net savings, lifetime income minus lifetime expenses, equals a person's contribution to society. It illustrates how much the person has given versus how much the person has taken on an economic basis, as measured in money. Using the saved money, it's possible to acquire productive factors by trading. In a less specialized society, imagine having spent the time building and accumulating tools and other productive factors that make work more productive. The same society also allows for a conversion of tools back into money for spending. It's a more abstract way of arranging matters than building a shoemaking machine which is capable of outputting a lifetime of shoes rather than having it output a pair of shoes every decade after the previous pair have worn out. Investing is simply the process of putting this idea into practice. An investor is thus a person who lives from his assets. A capitalist is an investor. A hunter-gatherer who has a way of life that has survived for tens of thousands of years is to a large extent also an investor. Investing typically requires a great deal of knowledge and familiarity with one's assets. Conversely, working requires a great deal of energy and vigor. This is why hunter-gatherers protect their old, and why farmers historically have focused on having many children. From the worker's perspective, an industrial society is closer to the farming community. In this case, the crops are people, specifically the products made by people. From the investor's perspective, it's the capital market that is of primary focus. Here, experience and wisdom are more important. For an investor, the start of financial independence includes a strong vision of one day creating a metaphorical forest and living harmoniously with the forest. It starts by planting seeds. These seeds grow into saplings, and the mind starts connecting the vision to the upcoming reality of a mature forest. When you live for the future, your present will very much be determined by the actions of your past. Hence, you'll only live in a forest if your past self at some point decided to plant the seeds. Contrast this with living for the present, in which case your future will be uncertain. A person living in the present would very much like to cut down that forest as soon as possible and turn it into paper. A future-oriented person would carefully try to preserve his principal asset, the forest, and only cut when necessary, living off the trimmings. He would think of his wealth as the amount of wood he can get by trimming, not the amount of wood he could get if he cut the forest down. Unfortunately, so many people see it differently. That is why they keep working to both cut down existing trees as well as planting seeds and cutting down the saplings as soon as they get the chance. They don't see the freedom that the mature forest offers. The entire focus is on maximum wood production in the present rather than minimum effort in the future. This frame of mind is pervasive. Retirement is seen as spending hoarded savings, and survivalists tend to focus on stocking up on tools and supplies. Rather than forming an environment which can sustain them, they accumulate assets to survive in an environment that isn't conducive to their living. Conversely, a hunter-gatherer lives in an environment conducive to living. The traditional hunter-gatherer works 15 hours a week to gather resources from his environment. With our level of technology and understanding, we can gather resources from our environment more effectively and only work a few hours a week, or part of the year, or develop enough assets to no longer work at all, letting others do the work. Personal economics. Personal economics is the study of the principles of how individuals can most efficiently acquire resources, create and derive utility, and decompose or dispose of the resulting waste in a way that turns it back into resources. Ideally, society would be set up in a sustainable fashion, so that the material cycle runs in a stable, non-growing fashion with no losses. In such a system, waste wouldn't be a problem, since it would serve as resources for the next cycle. For example, leftover food would be composted and turned into fertilizer for the next harvest, rather than ending up in landfills. Bags, houses, and even computers could be disposed of in a similar fashion, serving as raw materials for the next evolution. Currently, this is far from the case. Modern living mostly involves producing products, consuming them, and throwing them out, with money driving the cycle. Now, it's possible to completely avoid dealing with this part of the economy and never set foot in a shopping center or pay for anything with money. However, although interesting, such self-imposed constraints aren't optimally efficient. As bad as the normal consumer economy is, it has its good points, so some interaction is desired or even necessary. The more interaction with the local economy by systems-thinking people, and the listener should be one by this point, the better the likelihood of societal change. This interaction requires money, and so it requires some means of acquiring money. This can be done in two ways: you working for money or money working for you. In a money economy, the flow of money is a bit more complicated than this. 7.1. Financial cash flow cycles. This section describes the different ways money flows for different people operating within a free market economy. In the simplest possible financial cycle for a salaried person, you work, which results in a wage, which you spend on stuff, which you consume. Here, stuff represents actual stuff, as well as services, like dental work, car insurance, and so on. This is the work, spend, consume cycle described in chapters 2 and 3. The work, spend, consume method is a very simple way of managing finances. There's only one source of income, and it's impossible to spend money that hasn't been earned. All you need is a job and a bank account. If the employer pays in cash, you don't even need a bank account. Running the cycle and continuously replacing your stuff produces waste, which is comprised of discarded stuff that hasn't been consumed by you. While some think that more waste means more living, it's clear that the more waste, for example, superfluous bedrooms, time spent commuting, clothes never worn, things collecting dust on the shelves, the faster the cycle must run and the harder or more you must work. People who are credit-worthy, which until recently meant practically anybody, as people didn't even need to be alive to be pre-approved, can then use credit to increase their spending on stuff. Using financing to buy more stuff than is otherwise affordable puts you into debt. Some of your wage is now diverted into your monthly car, furniture, or mortgage payments and is no longer going into stuff. Moreover, part of those debt payments constitutes interest and finance charges and similar ways that other people, like lenders, are getting paid for fronting the money you spend on stuff. What sometimes happens is that this cycle spirals out of control. This can happen if there's no negative feedback, which is the case if credit limits are increased to no end, or if minimum payments are held down to make the payback period extremely long. This is profitable to the lender, as long as the borrower doesn't default. When you are fully in debt, All of your wage is directed towards paying off your bills, and stuff can only be bought through continued use of credit. This stage is right at the limit of defaulting, because payments can barely be made. A job loss would push you into default. The only option then would be to negotiate a lower interest rate that will lower the payment, and then spend the extra money paying off debt rather than spending it on more stuff. Even when not liable for debt payments, the dependence on having to spend to get stuff, which can be thought of as another liability, means that losing the wage will cause serious hardship. To prevent this, wise people establish a so-called emergency fund, which is an attempt to hedge against all the liabilities in your life with a cash reserve. If wages are no longer forthcoming, the emergency fund can provide a temporary cash flow to continue spending. To establish the fund, spending must be reduced to divert money to savings. Its size depends on a fair estimate of the current liabilities, that is, money that needs to be spent until the lost wage can be replaced. Naturally, this depends on duration, the likely reduced amount of spending, and the loss of the wage relative to other sources of income. The emergency fund is no different from normal savings used for presents, large purchases, and so on. Savings are essentially delayed consumption. The same goes for retirement savings, which are essentially a very big fund intended to last from retirement until death. A person, particularly a non-salaried working man, may have several sources of income, either in the form of multiple clients or serial contracts. If each job can cover expenses, the diversification provides security. This may also be thought of as working one job and having multiple clients. Due to the unsteady nature of his income, the working man will likely rely on savings in between jobs. Since periods without work are a way of life, emergency fund is hardly the right term, but the principle is the same. Having more than one income stream provides more security due to diversification. Of course, a working man can go into debt as well, and a salaryman can take on side jobs. The complete, albeit somewhat simplified, picture for many people will thus incorporate most of the elements introduced earlier. That is, you work one or more jobs to earn a wage, which goes into savings, like emergency and retirement funds, stuff, some of which is waste, and debt, or credit, some of which is diverted to other people. This system is generally tightly coupled and complicated, but typically not complex. There are many books dedicated to decoupling by introducing buffers and simplifying the system, mostly by consolidating whatever serves the same function. For example, 2 bank accounts become 1. Some subscribe to automating everything with automatic payments, while others prefer to make each payment manually. I suppose this is like the difference between driving a manual and an automatic transmission. It really doesn't matter, and it's merely a question of personal preference, as long as you choose whatever you're comfortable with. Personally, I prefer the manual option since it allows for more control, which makes it easier to fix things when, not if, they go wrong. More important, though, is the primary reason that so many complain that they're not getting ahead, which is apparent from the cash flow cycle. It's the loss of wage to waste and other people. This constitutes a lot of hard work for nothing, and it's the reason why so many after decades of work have so little to show for it. The previous chapters have mostly dealt with strategies for reducing this loss. It's perfectly possible to live well using those methods, and the strategies and tactics can either be used to simply prioritize resources, for example, spending on things that mean something to you, like vacations to the South Pole, antique furniture, brand name educations, and so on, or only working seasonally and living the rest of the year on savings, or alternatively, only working a few hours a week. Or, as will be covered later on, the money can be spent on assets which will provide enough cash flow to completely eliminate having to work for money. A worker acquires assets by consuming less than his income and then saving and investing the rest. Investing most of your wage in assets instead of spending it on stuff allows your assets to produce an additional cash flow that can be spent on stuff. This cash comes from other people who pay for the usage of your assets. The cash flow from wage to stuff is thus reduced. Owning stocks means that the investor gets the profit, but not the wage, when other workers produce goods and services. Owning rental units means that the investor gets paid for the use of his home. Owning bonds means that the investor gets paid for the use of his money. Combining the cash flow cycle based on debt with the cycle based on assets, we can narrow the economic system down to only 2 people, the creditor, who provides the assets, and the debtor, who pays for those assets. In reality, there are many creditors and debtors, which shows how these 2 types of people fit into the economic system. It also explains why the rich get richer and why those who are in debt and work for a living never seem to get ahead. In reality, the assets are diversified via the financial system, so that each asset owner gets paid a little amount from many different people, and each debt owner uses the assets of many different people as well. However, figuratively speaking, it is quite possible to match up the relative sizes of the cash flows between two people. For example, I spend about as much on my total living expenses as an upper-middle-class family spends on their mortgage interest alone. Effectively speaking, I've lent them my money so they can have a house with 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a vaulted foyer, and a 2-car garage. In return, they pay all my expenses. Hopefully, we both consider this a good deal. I know I do. In a free country, roles are chosen, not assigned. Most people choose to become debtors and borrow money so they can increase their spending, possibly due to a lack of knowledge, or maybe simply due to the barrage of advertising that says spending money will result in happiness. However, it's possible to choose the creditor side and save money, eventually buying financial independence. Such financial independence comes from investing in income-generating assets until the cash flow from the assets, or more accurately, other people paying for the assets, completely covers all spending on stuff. Here, all wages go to increasing assets and work can stop at any time, at which point you will be financially independent. 7.2. Working for money. Work has been defined in many different ways, the most appropriate being, I know it when I see it, and very often includes activities that one does not want to do. The best way to think of work is as a package which includes several different goals, such as cash flow, contributing to society, personal edification, socializing, having something to do all day, and so on. In many cases, cash flow isn't considered the primary reason to work. Many state meaning or passion as the main reason for working. However, even if that is the case, the cash flow to pay for stuff, which can't be otherwise acquired due to lack of skills or connections, is a crucial part of work. When cash flow comes from work, it's called earned income. Earned income is made either by working for an employer or working at a business you own, and it always requires spending time and effort. Earning income is therefore a process of exchanging your time for money. For example, suppose the actuarial tables say you have 60 years left to live, and you work 1 year in exchange for $30,000 net. You now have 59 years left, but you also have $30,000, which you would not have gotten otherwise. Similarly, you can exchange more years for more money. Many exchange most of their time for money. If we subtract the time spent on work plus associated tasks and sleep in a 24-hour day, there's very little time left, perhaps less than 25%. However, money can be spent to avoid spending time directly. For example, earning $10 to buy a cast iron pan takes less time than building your own pan from scratch. Money can also be invested to get more money to spend, thus avoiding having to exchange time. Different arrangements define the restrictions on your time and money stream. I divide them into salaried work, which covers the typical arrangement of a salaryman, and non-salaried work, which covers the typical arrangements of a working man or businessman. Within the context of the Renaissance lifestyle, there are 3 financial strategies to pursue: intermittent work, financial independence, also known as early retirement, or semi-retirement, supported by a form of part-time work. The beauty of combining the Renaissance lifestyle with working for money is that as long as you can get and hold a job for a handful of years, the strategy is robust and practical in the sense that success relies more on internal qualities like focus, discipline, persistence, and spending behavior, which are under your control, than on external circumstances like career or business success or a lucky run in the real estate or stock market, which are not directly under your control. Salaried and non-salaried work feel different from each other due to the different ways time is exchanged and remunerated. Very likely you already work, so instead of starting something new, it's most convenient to keep doing whatever it is you currently do to make money, while beginning to work on ways to make yourself more economically independent and financially resilient. If you haven't started making money yet, seriously consider getting into a field with guaranteed income potential. About the worst thing anyone can do financially is to spend 4 years piling up student loans for a degree with a low starting salary. Here, it's not so much the starting salary which is the problem as it's the debt. If you're going to finance a degree, you better calculate the internal rate of return first. 7.2.1 Salaried Work. Salaried work provides a very predictable money stream and typically a very predictable work schedule, involving showing up every weekday except for about 10 to 25 days each year. A salary is paid when productivity is hard to measure because the effort can't be directly associated with a specific revenue-generating product or service. This means that productivity has little bearing on how much a person actually gets paid, salary being determined by contract negotiation skills and historical accidents, such as being hired the year before new hires are given a substantially higher starting salary. It may be that this is what has led to the widespread secrecy about what coworkers are paid. Such secrecy maintains order, because although managers may not be aware of how hard their people work, everybody knows, or rather has an opinion, about how productive their coworkers really are. Piecework is often salaried because it's cheaper for an employee to train one full-time employee than it is to train two half-time employees. The systemic consequence is unemployment, and thus competition for full-time jobs, which drives salaries down. Conversely, it also creates more job security with a given employer, since hourly paid workers are the first to be laid off during downturns. Even if a salaried job does not involve piecework, it's often expected for employees to be present regardless of whether they're being productive or not. This often leads to water cooler talk for hours, pretend work, and other non-productive activities, which many people actually enjoy. The preponderance of this is, of course, company-dependent, but seems somewhat proportional to the size of the company and the amount of bureaucratic procedure. But I don't think it's inaccurate to suggest that the atmosphere is much like high school or college. However, being paid on salary can lead to less satisfaction, since the effort-reward connection is broken when the employee realizes that he gets paid the same amount regardless of how much or how little he works. Realizing that pay often has more to do with negotiation skills, politics, or tenure than productivity or even responsibility can be depressing. It divides the workforce into three kinds of people, popularly known as workhorses, show horses, and horses' asses. In particular, some will realize that they can get further ahead through office politics and career management than conscientious work. Some will realize that showing up and doing the minimum amount of work will pay equally well, and some will not realize either one. I'll let you guess which horse is which. Traditionally, salaried work entails some form of continuous career where breaks are frowned upon. Furthermore, it'll be very hard to negotiate leaves of several weeks to take vacations or work on other things. There may be non-compete agreements to sign or other kinds of golden handcuffs and behavioral restrictions. For these reasons, and because it tends to pay well due to the large number of hours worked, salaried work is the preferred method for accumulating a fund for financial independence. There's plenty of advice out there, the most important piece of which is, in my opinion, to pursue something you're good at rather than something you're passionate about. These are not necessarily the same thing. And consider the typical placement rates, or unemployment levels, and in particular, the cost of any kind of educational requirement using either a discounted cash flow or internal rate of return analysis to see if it's worthwhile. 7.2.2 Non-salaried work. Though it may involve contracting with a single employer, technically a client, non-salaried work shouldn't be considered employment, though it still qualifies as a job. Such a job involves either providing services or making products directly, or involves running a business, turning assets into income. In both cases, the connection between effort and reward is readily apparent, and work thus provides a greater amount of satisfaction. In particular, working extra, overtime, is compensated. Conversely, working less, undertime, isn't compensated. Non-salaried work is therefore one level closer to reality in the sense that if no action is taken, no compensation appears. Since the work is, in a sense, more real, credentials and politics become less important. It'll be easier to tell a good job from a bad job. In addition, in some cases, it'll be possible for you to tell exactly how your contribution added value. For example, you bought 1,000 pens for $1 each, presented them in a store, and sold them for $3. Or you knitted a sweater and sold it. Or you repaired someone's moped. In a larger system, it'll often be hard to tell exactly what the point of those Form 32B4s you spent all day filing is in terms of the operation of the company. It's interesting to note that even if the latter pays better, it can often be less satisfying due to the lack of control or apparent purpose. Of course, it's also possible that you have been assigned to file Form 32B4s for some company as an outsourced contractor. In this case, there may not be any particular satisfaction in doing such a job. Sometimes this kind of piecework is paid on an hourly basis. This happens when it's hard to estimate the price of individual pieces because they're all unique. Lawyers' fees, filing reports, and editing papers comes to mind. This arrangement suffers the same problems as salaried compensation. However, since hours are strictly recorded, there's no longer any pay for water cooler talk, and working under such terms would be considered less cushy than doing the same job under salaried conditions. In many countries, many social services, such as healthcare, are provided for by the government. But in the U.S., many of these services are provided for by corporations, to those who are salaried corporate employees. This is made possible through group negotiation power, similar to trade unions at the employer level, and special tax breaks. Typically, a non-salaried worker has to provide these benefits for himself, and if he's self-employed, he'll also be paying full Social Security taxes, whereas employees only pay half, and the employer pays the other half. It's therefore not easy to compare income between salaried and non-salaried work. Furthermore, it's not easy to evaluate the value of such benefits. For example, there are people who work almost exclusively for the benefits part of the compensation because they need their benefits to pay for drug treatments. Conversely, others get overcovered. For example, employees without children have no use for the free daycare services, yet it's part of their compensation package. The upside of non-salaried work is often a greater deal of control over one's time. This means that if the goal is to pursue some form of intermittent work interspersed with longer periods of non-work, non-salaried work is superior. Some jobs are location independent, such as anything that involves information. And some jobs, for example contractors, are so ubiquitous that they are de facto location independent. Conversely, some jobs like accounting, law, and medicine are regionally licensed, and, say, a dentist who is capable of treating people in country A will probably not legally be able to set up shop in country B. Since non-salaried work is compensated per effort, it may be possible to put in supreme amounts of effort and end up with a very high total compensation by working around the clock. For example, I'm a freelance editor, and I bring in a few $100 a month whenever the mood strikes. But I could theoretically make a six-figure income if I put in the same effort I used to put into my salaried job. This could significantly speed up the accumulation of savings. Conversely, it may be difficult to find sufficient work or sufficient energy to put in that much effort, since measurable work is often directly taxing of physical or mental energy. 7.3. Making money work for you. Until I was 25, it never occurred to me that money could work for me. I was certainly aware that money could be invested, and in return I'd get a fraction of it back each year in the form of interest or dividends. What hadn't occurred to me was that this money could reach a level equivalent to my expenses, and that this money could then pay for things just as well as earned income does. I think many share this same mental block, because savings accounts are either very small, such that the annual payout may only pay for a night out on the town, or because savings are cordoned off in retirement accounts, where the payouts go right back into savings. This prevents people from thinking about capital income, just as taking income taxes directly out of earnings before the paycheck is received prevents people from thinking about taxes, other than as an abstraction that's out of their control. If you decide to make money work for you, over time you'll become very familiar with the tax law, how to get money out of retirement accounts while paying as little penalty as possible, and how to take care of the principal and keep the yield sustainable, to the point of being at least competent as previously defined in the section on gauging mastery. Again, individual plans will vary significantly, but the guiding principles will be quite similar. The rest of this chapter will therefore discuss overall principles which should hold for the next 100 years, rather than specific investment plans which may change within a decade. 7.3.1. Important financial ratios. Within the field of personal finance, there is a lot of discussion about salaries, net worths, and what one's quote-unquote number or savings needed to retire is. However, when analyzing the financial status of different people, it makes more sense to look at ratios than absolute numbers to see how well someone is doing. This is no different than analyzing financial statements of different-sized companies by dividing by equity, earnings, or assets, or by gauging the strength of a person relative to his body weight rather than his absolute strength. Emergency funds. Let's divide the income stream from working into three categories: spending on wants, spending on needs, and saving. For example, a typically recommended savings rate for the average consumer is 10%, while the division between needs and wants depends on personal circumstances. Most need far less than they think. But let's assume that 60% is spent on needs, 30% is spent on wants, and 10% is saved. As a general rule, emergency funds only need to replace needs. With the numbers mentioned, it thus takes 6 months to build an emergency fund that will supply all needs for 1 month because spending is 6 times savings. If the emergency or lack of job income lasts more than 1 month, one will be wiped out and start to default. If an emergency is expected to last 6 months, one thus needs 6 times as much money. With the 10% savings rate, it will take 6 times 6 months, or 3 years, to build this fund. If emergencies happen more frequently, which isn't completely unlikely, then one will be wiped out because there is not enough time to rebuild the emergency fund. Consider another example for someone with the same savings rate, 10%. But here the split between needs and wants is 20% and 70% respectively, versus 30% and 60% in our previous example. Importantly, this person uses far less on needs than the person in our previous example. By utilizing a much smaller percentage of income on needs, in this case it takes only 2 months of savings to replace 1 month of spending on needs. If the emergency fund is to last the same 6 months, then the time it takes to fully fund the emergency fund is 1 year, instead of the 3 years in the first example. This means that for the same savings rate, a budget dominated by flexible, loosely coupled wants is more resilient than a budget dominated by inflexible, tightly coupled needs. Now consider a third example. Here the savings rate is doubled to 20%, needs are 20%, and wants are 60%. Here it takes only 1 month of savings to replace 1 month of spending on needs. To create the 6-month emergency fund only takes half a year. This is the safest distribution of spending and saving of the 3 examples, but one can do even better, as we'll learn shortly. The conclusion here is that the higher the ratio of savings rate to needs, the safer one is from emergencies. Also, the higher the ratio of wants to needs, in other words, having more wants and fewer needs, the safer the person is. Intuitively, this makes sense. The less you need and the more you save, the safer you are. It should now be easy to calculate the size of an emergency fund. All you need is to identify your needs relative to your income, your savings relative to your income, and the expected duration of your emergency, which we define as how long it will take to find a new job, depending on your profession and the economy. You also need to estimate the frequency of your emergencies, or how often you expect to get laid off. Savings rate for financial independence. An emergency fund represents financial independence on the simplest level because it means that given an emergency, there's no need to borrow money to replace living expenses. Let us consider the required savings rate to replace both needs and wants, also known as the savings rate for financial independence. If the savings rate is 10%, needs and wants total 90%. Therefore, it takes 9 years of working, 90 divided by 10, to save enough money for 1 year's worth of needs and wants while not working. If the savings rate is 20%, needs and wants total 80%, and so it takes 4 years of working, 80 divided by 20, to replace 1 year's worth of needs and wants. And if the savings rate is 50%, 1 year of working saves enough money to take 1 year off. To figure out how many years of financial independence a specific savings rate enables, divide the sum of wants and needs by the savings rate. As a formula, this is the quantity of 100% minus the savings rate, all divided by the savings rate. Note that 100% minus your savings rate must exactly equal the sum of your wants and needs. Also note that this calculation doesn't consider emergency and retirement savings. If you'd like, include retirement savings and emergency fund savings under general spending. Intermittent work. It's important to note that the time periods we've discussed are arbitrary and irrelevant. Given a 50% savings rate, there's no rule that one has to work for 1 year and take the next year off, although this solution is growing in popularity. It's equally valid to work for 3 years and take the next 3 years off. A flexible work schedule would mean that instead of counting in years, you could count in months or even days or hours. Anyone interested in a 1-hour workday? To get more specific, with a 20% savings rate, you could take 1 month off each time you work for 4 months, or 1 day off each time you work for 4 days. Alternatively, with a 75% savings rate, you could work for 3 months and take the rest of the year off. This works for anyone with a great deal of control over the timing of his income. For example, entrepreneurs, seasonal workers such as farmers and tax accountants, freelancers, skilled travelers, contractors, and handymen. In general, anyone who can easily find work without committing to an extended employment. Conversely, this level of scheduling flexibility is hard to attain for salaried career professionals. 7.3.2 Financial Independence and Investing. The calculations we've discussed don't take investment returns on the fund into account. It stands to reason that if someone accumulates a 9-year fund and invests it with a 5% return, it will last longer than 9 years before it runs out, because the fund earns investment returns on the money that hasn't been spent yet. Presuming that the returns can be guaranteed, more about that later, it's possible to calculate exactly how long such a fund will last if it compounds interest. We can calculate the length of the fund with a basic assumption. The fund has an initial size from which the same dollar amount is withdrawn at the beginning of each year, and the rest of the money earns interest during the year. To keep you from falling asleep, we won't derive the formula in this audiobook, but please do take a look at the PDF for the full derivation and to plug in numbers appropriate to your life. This equation is the key formula for extreme early retirement. The formula relates the number of retirement years, defined as your life expectancy upon retiring, to the rate of return on your portfolio and the size of your portfolio. The size of your portfolio can be given in either withdrawal rates or the equivalent years of fund measure. Note that these two numbers are each other's exact inverse, since if the initial fund size is given in years, then spending is defined as 1 year's worth of expenses. For now, let's dive into a couple of examples. If we have a 10-year fund which pays out 1 year's worth of spending annually and earns a 4% interest rate, it will last 12.38 years rather than just 10 years. In comparison, a 20-year fund with the same interest rate and spending parameters lasts 37.39 years. This is highly interesting because by doubling the savings before beginning the withdrawal, an additional 15 years will be gained on top of the 2.38 years from the 10-year fund's interest. One point to take note of is that it's possible to build a portfolio that lasts forever. If yearly spending is less than or equal to the investment return, the portfolio is a perpetuity and will preserve the principal forever. In the PDF, you can view a chart showing how long various fund sizes will last with different interest rates. It's a great visualization of how critical investing is to your retirement. If you don't invest, an N-year fund will only last N years. If you invest, it's possible to preserve your principal forever. I'd like to take a moment to draw a clear distinction between early retirement and traditional personal finance. In traditional personal finance planning, the amount of time your money is invested is the most important factor, with typical values around 30 or 40 years. Some people will be clever enough to achieve superior investment returns, but they are few and far between. We are not counting on this happening. In the case of early retirement, although our money may not be invested for a long time, we plan to earn steady conservative investment returns that are in the usual range, maybe around 6%. However, our main lever is the savings rate. While a traditional savings rate of 10% builds a 1-year fund in 9 years, an extreme savings rate of 75% builds a 1-year fund in just 4 months. That's 27 times faster. Even with a lot of time to compound and a market outperformance of a few percent, it's hard to beat a factor of 27. To illustrate this point, let's take a look at what it takes to build a 30-year fund. A fund nominally lasting 30 years should be safe to retire on in most circumstances. For example, a 30-year fund will last 70 years even at a modest 3% return rate. But note that a traditional savings rate of 15% requires a little over 30 years of work to create that fund given generous average investment returns of 10%. If, on the other hand, investment returns drop to a conservative 6%, more than 45 years of work is required. Not only do traditional savings rates mean working for 40 years or more, they're very dependent on the investment return rate. This brings us to the most important statement in this chapter. High savings rates lead to extremely early financial independence. There's also an extreme difference between a savings rate of, say, 35%, which most people would consider to be high, and a savings rate of 75%. Saving 3/4 of one's income creates financial independence in about 5 years. Conversely, a savings rate of 15% requires about 35 years of work at a return rate of 6%, about 20 years of work at an optimistic 10% rate, and about 45 years at a 4% rate. The PDF contains some figures that emphasize our last 2 points. It takes a very long time to build a safe retirement fund if you're not saving a large percentage of income, and high savings rates lead to extremely early financial independence. 7.3.3 Investing and Reasonable Return Rates. In the real world, it is unlikely that your interest rate will stay constant. The principal may also vary substantially if it is invested in the market. Furthermore, there is inflation to contend with. The equations derived earlier therefore have to be expanded or used with a significant margin of safety. It's very tempting to plug in return rates of 10% or even higher and derive very favorable terms. For example, a mere 15% savings rate and a return rate of 10% allows one to retire early after about 20 years of work. The problem with such exercises is known as garbage in, garbage out. The limitations of the formulae must be understood to use them. The financial world abounds with stories of people and companies that put too much faith in their equations without understanding the limits. To give an example of a more realistic derivation, suppose we invest in a broad market index and assume that future rates of return and future rates of inflation will exactly match those of the past. Then we can pick a historical set of returns and go through a calculation similar to the equations we use to determine how long a fund will last if it compounds interest, except each year we use the value of the interest rate equal to that of the market return for the corresponding year. Additionally, we account for inflation by using the corresponding historical values, increasing the amount withdrawn at the beginning of each year by the rate of inflation for each year. This can be done numerically. The analytic equation is just a quick way to derive the result when the values are assumed to be constant. If calculated numerically with historic data, it will quickly be found that the results we want vary depending on the range of years the historic data are taken from. Using data from 1980 to 2005 will be different from using data from 1935 to 1960. To compensate for this, all possible periods from the past can be calculated. This is called a Monte Carlo simulation, and there is one available at firecalc.com. Of course, this is only accurate if the future repeats the past numbers. Still, plotting for all possible historical periods shows how things have played out historically. This exercise can be repeated for different markets, such as domestic equity, international equity, commodities, real estate, timber, and so on, and for different investment methods like buy and hold, dividends, and dogs of the Dow. It will, however, quickly become clear that there are limits to how much the model can be fitted to the data. The objective of this exercise isn't to get a numerical value, but to get a sense of possible future scenarios, assuming that the future will likely repeat the past in one way or another. Numerical simulations require a lot of effort, so it's easier and more accurate to account for inflation and return rates by setting your interest rate to be the real rate of return, which equals the nominal rate of return minus inflation. Also, consider that official inflation numbers may not necessarily pertain to you. Consumer inflation is calculated based on what consumers buy, and this will likely be quite different from what you buy. Given this uncertainty, what is one to do? Accept that the worst that can happen is that your investments thoroughly collapse, which will likely mean the economy is dealing with mass unemployment or some other calamity. This in turn means that whoever pays their expenses with work will also be in trouble. In particular, since they don't know how to live efficiently, they will be in bigger trouble than you are, since they need to find high-income jobs, whereas you have a much larger selection of low-income jobs. In such a disaster, you may be poor with a low income, but everybody else will be broke with no income. As an investor, I live with the fact that sometimes markets go down, which makes me feel poorer, but also makes stocks cheaper to buy. Sometimes they go up, which makes me feel rich, but also makes stocks more expensive to buy. We can calculate expectation values forever and ever, but they are just that, expectations. Nothing can be guaranteed. Reaching financial independence and having your money work for you at an early point means projecting out 60 years. A lot can happen in 60 years, including accidents that disable those who work for money, or technological changes that render entire industries obsolete. Take, for example, typewriters, telex machines, coach wagons, trolley cars, and transatlantic blimps. However, it's likely that it'll still be possible to invest in some manner even 60 years from now. There's no telling whether those investments will be in the stock market, government debt, personal debt, annuities, mortgages, timber, real estate, plankton farms, cattle, potable water, topsoil, or what have you. It would be a big mistake to think that a choice made now will also be valid only 10 years from now. Just as any particular investment vehicle I could suggest now will probably sound silly a decade from now. 30 years ago, everybody hated stocks but loved gold. 20 years ago, mutual funds were the hottest thing. Then, after a decade of trending stock markets, which moved up no matter what people owned, it was decided that the managers weren't needed and index funds came into fashion. Why do you need a manager if markets go up all on their own? At that point, nobody wanted to own gold. In the past 10 years, the market has been in a trading range, and now gold is more expensive than ever. So who knows what the future will bring? My suggestion is not to presume that one can pick an asset class and then stick with it forever. Despite this, there are a few established principles in the art of investing. Reward is often correlated with risk, where risk can either be quantified as volatility or qualified as uncertainty. That is, lack of knowledge. This means that the higher the return rate, the higher the risk of loss of capital. Another principle, however, says that risk is more related to skill and knowledge. Both of these statements are true, but for different reasons. If you think about a fast race car, it's a more risky vehicle to drive, but if you know how to drive it, the risk goes down. There are two conclusions from this. First, having a margin of safety in terms of principal is a good idea. In other words, having a low withdrawal rate is safer than a high withdrawal rate, because the required rate of return is lower. A larger fund thus allows for more safety. Second, invest in what you understand, rather than what people tell you. This is the main reason I'm not telling you what to invest in. If you don't know anything about investing, make it a point to learn. It will be your new financial function in the world. There's no hurry. The investment return is fairly unimportant during the accumulation period as long as it is short. A lot of learning can happen during those years. People go to college and get degrees in the time you have to learn how to manage your money. I invest in stocks because I've spent almost a decade reading about stock investing. Conversely, I know little about real estate investment. If you're more interested in real estate, perhaps you should invest in that instead. Some people own timberland, and every few years they sell lumber and live off the proceeds. The reason I invest in stocks is a combination of personal interest, personal temperament, and historical accident. It's not because I have determined they are a superior investment by any means. Each market has its idiosyncratic volatility and return rates. Timber, for instance, grows independent of what the market does, at a rate of about 3 to 4% per year. If prices are low, you simply wait to cut until they are high again. As lumber remains a major part of the economy, it can be expected to rise in price in sync with inflation. The U.S. stock market has historically returned about 10% nominally. Other stock markets have returned different amounts. Note that this result includes a significant 2-decade-long bull market between 1983 and 2000. Other times, it has been flat for decades. In the periods of 1905 to 1942, 1965 to 1983, and 2000 to 2007, market return was either zero or negative. Some of these periods are really long. If the investment strategy relies on capital gains, as it does in a buy and hold strategy, this will lead to failure if the withdrawal rate is too high during years of decline, as too much stock will be liquidated when the market is low. Monte Carlo simulations suggest that a withdrawal rate of 4% is good for 30 years of inflation-adjusted expenses, and that a withdrawal rate of 3% is good for 60 years or more. A withdrawal rate of 2% will last forever, that is, if history repeats itself. In the long run, real estate always goes up, at the rate of inflation. Despite ups and downs and bubbles and crashes, the rate of inflation is the long-term trend. This makes sense because houses are non-productive things. The reason people get rich in real estate is because regulations, or lack thereof, allow fantastic amounts of leverage which can be used during bubbles. However, if the principal asset is in the form of rental units and rents can be raised with inflation, inflation is taken care of. The withdrawal rate is then simply based on the average fill rate, say 80% or 4 out of 5 units, times the cash flow minus maintenance costs and taxes divided by the value of the units. In summary, the organic growth of any sector seems to concentrate around 3% real growth. This is the number I would use as a safe withdrawal rate. It's difficult to judge whether this number will be representative of the next 50 to 100 years. First, human population growth will peak out and probably decrease again within this period. The energy available from fossil fuels that underlies the economy will certainly reverse and decline as fast or faster than it has been growing. Maybe consumerism as a productivity engine will cease and people will begin to maintain their stuff or wear it out instead of buying new all the time, which would significantly reduce the need to produce. Conversely, historical interest rates dating back thousands of years, for example as measured in repayment of a borrowed pig or borrowed grain at the next harvest, are easily as high as 100% per year. If I was a skilled pig or grain banker, I would happily assume higher rates. But for someone who just pays attention to money management issues for a couple hours every month or so, I would be comfortable with 3% for now. The true cost of things. Earlier, we gave a quick way of estimating the assets required to be financially independent of a given recurring expense. Using a conservative rate of return of 3%, we find that each dollar per month not spent is equivalent to reducing the required fund size by $401. In other words, a fund size of $401 earning 3% yields $12 annually, just the amount needed to support the $1 monthly expense. The cost of a $20 monthly payment may seem inexpensive to someone earning $15 per hour, but with an asset-based income, it actually represents $20 times 401. This equals $8,020, which represents over 4 months of work at the given hourly rate. Thus, frequently it costs much less to pay more for a one-time expense than to get involved in a recurring expense. If, for example, the monthly cable bill is $40, the corresponding asset-based equivalent is $16,040. That amount can buy a lot of movies and computer games, and those can be leveraged into even more movies and games by swapping them. So, what should I invest in? How would you like to manage your money? Do you prefer to do it yourself or outsource the job? Do you like accounting and reading reports, or are you more interested in remodeling bathrooms and dealing with tenants? Maybe you're more interested in owning farmland for rent, or windmills or solar panels producing electricity, a blog or blogging network, or other low-maintenance ventures. Until you know the answer to these questions, don't buy anything. Take time to figure out the answer while accumulating cash. If the number of years worked is small, the strength of your interest rate, which depends on your investing skills, doesn't matter that much while saving. I saved cash at a measly interest rate in a bank account for 4 years while reading about stock investing before I began investing in stocks. This doesn't mean that you have to invest in stocks too. Furthermore, because I invest in stocks now doesn't mean I will be doing so for the next 50 years. If circumstances change, I'll change. Study the alternatives. Read, and then read some more. This is what investors do. This is what I do. Beware of the promise of high returns in general or brand new untested methods of investing. It's easy to get burned by this. If consistent returns of 12% or even 24% per year are possible, the fund size can be small indeed. However, if a new or exotic method, maybe pig lending, promises high returns, it's almost guaranteed that those returns will go down as more people buy in, or that the returns are simply not sustainable because the risks are far higher than anticipated. That said, if you decide that you have no interest in managing your own money, it's, as always, possible to pay money to compensate. You can pay another person to manage your money. You can pay for your mistakes, or you can pay in terms of opportunity costs for having an underperforming portfolio. In all these, the cost relative to the withdrawal rate will be high, because the withdrawal rate is generally low. Typical management fees are asset-based and could easily be 1%, which has to come out of the withdrawal rate. For example, if the withdrawal rate is 4% and 1% goes to fees, it only leaves 3% for expenses. In other words, 25% of the cash flow is spent on management fees. With fees this high, it means that the fund has to be proportionately larger to support financial independence. Some will point to low or no fee arrangements, but these often have a price in opportunity costs. Is it worth it to spend time and effort learning how to manage your money yourself, rather than increasing the number of years worked? That's up to you. 7.3.4 Asset Management. Asset-based income is fundamentally different from work-based income. The primary difference is that asset-based income is proportional to assets and skill, whereas work-based income is proportional to time spent and skill. Both require skills, albeit different skills, so the difference is time versus assets. Naturally, asset management requires some time, for example, to think and observe, and work requires some assets, like tools and resources, but the ratio between them is markedly different. Consider a scenario where $2,000 in assets yields 4%, or $80, without effort, but where asset management will raise the yield to 6%, $120. This is a difference of $40 from a few hours of work. It's presumed that the hours spent learning to do this work won't need to be repeated. Once learned, there's no need to relearn. Spending more than a couple hours managing $1,000 in assets is therefore not worthwhile, as the hourly return on time would dip below the working wage. Now consider having $200,000 in assets yielding 4%, or $8,000. Raising the yield to 6%, $12,000, is a difference of $4,000, which is a very nice return for a few hours of effort. The exact same work effort, but now leveraged with more assets. 2 observations. First, with almost no assets, the hourly compensation is too low to bother managing the assets. Conversely, with 6-figure assets, the hourly return can be substantial. Second, even when the hourly wage is substantial, asset management doesn't allow you to keep increasing your income by putting in more hours like working does. The total compensation is thus less than what could be made while working for money until assets exceed income by a factor of 25 or more. Since few people have that kind of money, they're often advised to apply the minimum amount of effort when it comes to investing. With asset management, skill and wisdom are rewarded directly proportionally to the asset base, but never proportionately to the time base. This is probably the most important cultural barrier to overcome, in a society that prides itself on being busy and productive. Frequently, asset managers get wealthy just by waiting and being wise. The real challenge, especially faced by professional asset managers, but hopefully not by you, is the tendency to ignore this fact. Many associate effort with taking action, but not taking action is also a form of action. In fact, often not taking action is just what is required. The easiest way to get in the right frame of mind is to stop thinking like a farmer and start thinking like a hunter. A farmer, like a modern salary working or businessman, gets rewarded by activity. The more he does, the greater his reward. Conversely, a hunter isn't going to catch anything if he thrashes around in the woods, frantically looking for prey. A strategy where he first identifies the best place to hunt, using skill, and then waits patiently for the opportunity to present itself will be more successful. In this sense, the farmer-turned-hunter is his own worst enemy. Patience is a virtue that can take years or maybe even decades to develop. An impatient investor is likely to fire off all his arrows before the situation is optimal and will never make as much money as someone who can wait. Conversely, an impatient farmer will keep his beds free of weeds, and therefore impatience and a strong inclination towards productivity works for him. The goal of asset management or any management is to either create an environment or alternatively be in an environment that allows for optimal yield. Here, optimal could mean the largest possible when adjusted for volatility, or the largest possible when adjusted for catastrophic loss. Like traditional management, micromanagement, which tries to increase yield by substituting time for assets, never provides the intended results. Investment science. Economics and investing is often said to suffer from physics envy, in that it would like to be an exact science. To do this, mathematics, which is precise though not necessarily accurate, is used to give the impression of accuracy. Using an equation is no substitute for understanding an equation. In fact, an equation isn't a black box where one cranks the handle to obtain a result. Rather, it's an idea formulated in another language, which just happens to be internally consistent, so that one idea may be transformed into another idea and remain consistent. In particular, the limitations of the equations should be understood. Very often, people make simplifying assumptions. For example, the efficient market theory, which simply says that price equals value, to make a problem mathematically tractable. This works well in physics because the universe seems to be inherently simple. It works poorly when it comes to predicting behavior because people, even when treated statistically, are complex. Investing is a skill to be learned. Copying requires no skill. The easiest thing to copy is the average, since there are few numbers simpler than the average to describe a set. The average is also known as the market index. Since copying requires no effort, the cost is zero, and so the return on effort is undefined. In particular, average is psychologically attractive because people like to compare themselves to others, and a guaranteed average usually feels better than below average. Staying with the progression of mastery, the next stage is comparing. A particularly poor and popular method at this stage is chasing yield, where people compare the returns of different investments, such as funds, stocks, and so on, and buy whatever has recently performed the best. Never do that. It is akin to shooting arrows into the location where a prey was hit a few hours ago. The next level is compiling. Here, understanding is presented as fairly long lists of rules or tips about things that have worked well at one point or another. It's not yet understood why they have worked, and it's difficult to choose one. Plus, the rules never seem to apply to a given investment all at the same time. However, having compiled a list of rules, one may use a screen to filter companies and even to sort them. It's thus a simple matter to calculate, say, the top 10 of the list, the bottom 10, or top 20 on a combined list. This takes emotion out of the game, and many quantitative systems work on this level. This takes some effort to set up, but once it is, it can run automatically. Coordinating rules requires understanding why some rules work better than others and why some only work in certain situations. This is a value judgment and a complex problem, which is mathematically intractable. Still, even at this level, you'll be competing with other investors who are likely using some of the same rules to form their strategies. The problem with these strategies is that the market is self-correcting, and so opportunities disappear even as they're created. It's like a lake with a limited number of fishing spots. If people start showing up at the same particular spot, the odds of catching anything goes down for the individual fisherman. At the highest level, there are people who create new rules. That is, they find some aspect of the market and the economy that allows them to predict more correctly what the future price of an asset will be. Since they don't have to share their edge, or fishing spot, with anyone, they can keep all the profit. Such research requires a bright mind and a lot of work, but the rewards are high, and of course, proportional to assets. Typically, new investment techniques start at this level and then diffuse down to the lower stages as more and more people pick them up and reduce the former edge, called alpha in investment parlance, to volatility, called beta in investment parlance. Various theories are in various stages of diffusion, with some still having an edge and others appearing to have no edge at all. Keep in mind, though, that you as an asset manager are not necessarily striving towards having an edge. Living off of your money will make preservation of principal, keeping up with inflation, minimizing taxes, and providing a stipend more important than outperforming the market. Epilogue. Upon graduating with a PhD in theoretical physics, I worked for 5 years as a research associate while saving around 75% of my net income. And then I retired with enough money to last me the rest of my life. I now make my living, if judged by income, as a capitalist, and if judged by my lack of spending, as my own personal cook, trainer, carpenter, electrician, mechanic, accountant, financial advisor, tailor, engineer, and so on. My economic role is to invest and indirectly provide the productive factors, like factories, tools, supermarkets, and cash registers that make work possible, rather than the 40 to 80 hours a week of work itself. My effort in that regard amounts to spending a few hours every month or so, and otherwise waiting for the money to make its way into my bank account from my investments. If those who work for a living knew how little time it takes to make money this way, they would probably be less willing to accept working 40 to 80 hours a week for 30 to 40 years. Of course, I needed to save the money that allowed me to become a capitalist, but anyone who can hold a regular job for a handful of years and who has the will to save most of it can do this. So maybe it's okay that I now get to enjoy the rest of my life without an alarm clock. What I mainly learned from my formal education, and I'd say in my experience this holds exclusively for going to grad school and writing a dissertation, was that I alone am responsible for and capable of making my decisions and solving my problems. As an undergraduate, and even when studying for my master's degree, it was always clear that I could get the answer from someone smarter than me if my own attempt failed. It was also clear that if I didn't manage to get the correct result, it was no big deal, since my work was in a certain sense redundant, as it was being duplicated by all my classmates. Furthermore, I was always being told what to do and when to do it. In that sense, what an institutional education resulting in a college degree does is to facilitate the replacement of your parents with your future bosses, moving you from being dependent on your parents knowing better to being dependent on an employer knowing better. Doing the doctorate, which aims for a very different goal, namely to produce independent researchers capable of doing original research, made me realize that the they or them that people always mention in the phrase, they'll think of something, had actually become me. As a result, I always feel slightly worried when I hear the phrase, they'll think of something. This changed my attitude towards problems and solutions, and I began to use the same approach that I used for my research job in the rest of my life, always trying to understand why something was the way it was, whether it could be different, and if so, how. Instead of adopting the standard money management plan of saving 15% in an index fund in my retirement plan while getting in debt up to my eyeballs, thanks to a starter home, I started looking into the principles behind the system I was living in. I realized that the standard option of becoming an indebted consumer was just one of many, but that if anyone wanted different options, they'd have to take a different and more active approach, rather than just asking what and when. I would need another plan. More accurately, I would need a strategy, and to make such a strategy, I would need to understand the underlying principles and the world they operated in. Since there are no career tracks available for aspiring Renaissance people, we necessarily have to work with the options that are available to us and bend them to our purposes. Since everybody has different options available to them, I didn't think presenting a specific plan would be very helpful. So this is the main reason for its absence. My own history doesn't seem to follow a plan, specifically because there was no plan. I was increasing my understanding as I went along, eventually crystallizing it into the philosophy I've written down in this book. Despite not having a plan, I had an intuitive grasp of the strategy and guiding principles, and I quickly learned most of the tactics, since these are very similar to standard frugal practice. The only thing left to do was to pick the level of effort, namely extreme, and stay disciplined. I like the goal I eventually reached. I love not having to work for money, which means that not only do I get to set my own hours, something which is also possible for the self-employed, but more importantly, I also get to spend all day doing things that don't necessarily need to be done to meet some income quota to put food on the table, like serving on a board of directors for a nonprofit startup, volunteering my time for bike repair, crewing in yacht races, and so on. Nor do I expect to remain interested in the same subjects all my life, or that I'll follow a career track someone else laid out for me. My withdrawal rate is very conservative, so my stream of money will very likely never run out. In fact, simply by doing nothing, I'm more likely to end up with more than $1 million in net worth when I reach traditional retirement age, which is much more than what most consumers will manage to save. I'm set for life, and I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, within reason, as long as I don't fall into any consumer traps. Having about 20 diversified streams of income from different investments, I never worry about being unemployed and not having a job. Yet many are afraid of diversified investment income despite having their job as their sole source of income and, by implication, their only source of food, shelter, and so on. The only reason that relying on just one job for money isn't considered risky is because it's a normal way of life, and most have gotten used to it, or at least accept it much like they accept the risk of driving bumper to bumper at 55 miles per hour on the freeway, despite the real possibility of the driver ahead of them suddenly losing control for whatever reason. If more people spent 5 years saving money and learning how to live efficiently on their investments, instead of spending 5 years to become plumbers or MBAs and 0 years on living efficiently, and therefore working for the rest of their lives, financial freedom might not seem so scary. For those who are still unsure, consider that the worst thing that can happen to me, compared to someone who works for a living, is that I have to go back to work and do what they have been doing all along. Yet if the market falls sufficiently to cause me to struggle, most people will have lost their retirement savings as well, and we would be in an economic situation with at least 30% unemployment. Relying on a salaried full-time job to make a living, therefore, does not seem any safer. In such a scenario, who would you consider more likely to do well, a consumer who relies on shopping for all his needs, or someone living as I do? When I was younger, I used to deride the idea of jocks and how being a college athlete certainly didn't contribute to education. Now, I believe it does. The most important part of education is forming your character, whether as a worker, capitalist, leader, or follower, or whether you deal with people, that is the social and the political, or reality. Participating in sports certainly builds character. This is partially, or perhaps the exclusive reason, so many people take up marathon running. Passing exams or keeping up a grade point average develops another kind of character, And this is why businesses are interested in students with good grades. Aside from the grades serving as a legal proxy in lieu of intelligence tests, employers know that overachievers follow and take instruction well. Indeed, there is a common confusion between an education and a degree. A degree is something you get at college which can be used as an entry ticket to the white-collar job market. Similarly, a certification is something that can be used as an entry ticket to the blue-collar job market. However, a character transformation can be attained pretty much anywhere, whether in a classroom, laboratory, job, the Peace Corps, the military, or the swim team. In fact, education is very different from training. Training is what you know, whereas education is who you are as a person. As a result, people receiving the same training can end up with very different educations. I do believe there is a certain moral aspect to education. It forms one's character, good or bad. In that sense, education is a form of indoctrination aimed to produce a certain attitude. This means that education works well if it reinforces and polishes an existing natural attitude. But it can be a painful experience if one is naturally incompatible with the indoctrination. This is why I don't believe that one education fits all. Ever notice how many successful business leaders are college dropouts? It did not take them long to realize that college was not helping them to become leaders and entrepreneurs. This is because a college education creates followers, or people who are habituated to being handed a bunch of instructions and then delivering a product, from years of practice. It doesn't matter what the form of the product is, that is, whether it's an essay or a math problem. The important parts are the assignments, the deadlines, the grades, and the annual reviews, a structure that is repeated at the employee level in corporations. I have found that I don't make a very happy salaryman. I should probably have gotten a clue from the fact that I was taking courses based on personal interest rather than strategically choosing the easy courses to optimize my grade point average. But I have, however, found that I make for a very happy Renaissance man. Like me, you may have gotten an education that wasn't compatible with your training. It may be that you don't know your type like I didn't know mine. Many confuse who they are with what they do. Some get an education for whatever reason and yet are not completely transformed into the intended result, just as children often don't do what their parents tell them to, but rather become the opposite in a counter-reaction. So it will be for education. This book is my contribution to your education. Thank you for listening to Early Retirement Extreme, a philosophical and practical guide to financial independence. Written by Jacob Lund Fisker, narrated by Douglas Martin, and published by Upfront Books. This edition is issued by contractual arrangement with Jacob Lund Fisker. Originally published as a paperback book, copyright 2010 by Jacob Lund Fisker.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.